Ooh, nice timing. Thank you, Chair Treem. All Assembly members are present in chambers besides Assembly Member Hugh Scandies and Mayor Weldon, who are absent. Thank you. Any additions or corrections to the minutes from September 7th? Seeing none, those minutes are approved. Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Chair Treem. Just a tiny good of the order. Finance department has been without an admin for quite some time. It's been challenging to hire, but we have welcomed Stevie Garlick, who's in the back of the room, as the new finance admin. So she'll be a regular feature here, joining CBJ from out of state. Made a decision to relocate to Juneau with her spouse and join the finance department. So this is great.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Welcome, Stevie. Good job bringing new people to Juneau. You get extra credit for that.
Yeah.
Oh. Well, that's a great segue into our first agenda topic, which is the Juneau Housing Stock and Short-Term Rental presentation from JEDC. Mr. Rogers, do you want to introduce this at all, or should we go straight to Mr. Holst? We'll go straight to Mr. Holst.
Thank you for that introduction, Mr. Rogers.
I'm sorry, I was distracted by the manager. We're already off the rails.
That's good. You were supposed to.
We're never on the rails.
I made it.
We can definitely blame the manager for that.
Mr. Holst is eminently capable of introducing himself.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be here, members of the Assembly and management team. So what we have tonight is a presentation around a research note that we did regarding Juneau's housing stock and short-term rentals. And you have the paper. I hope you've had a chance to look at that. And we're going to cover a little bit what's in the paper, but also just generally what we understand is to be the topic on minds is the housing situation in Juneau. We'll look at the short-term rentals, but we're also going to dive into at the end a little bit about some of the economic factors and how housing is affecting our economy, and give you our best guess at just about how much housing we need to build here in the next bit of time. So I'll just.
And Chair Treem, just people are following documents, right? Mr. Holst has given you a presentation, which is in the items we red folder for you tonight. And then there's the long form narrative note, which is separate, which was in the packet provided you on Friday.
This slide is just, we never want to not thank those people that provide contributions directly to JEDC to allow us to do our work, including research. And the City and Borough of Juneau is, as you know, a long-term supporter of the Juneau Economic Development Council. Next slide. You also appoint our board of directors. The mayor has a permanent seat. Ms. Treem is our liaison, and the UAS Chancellor also has a permanent seat. We focus on five main areas. Tonight, we're giving you within our economic development services, those sorts of questions that come up. We like to try to answer them for the community. So the question that we have tonight is a research question that was posed to us. Essentially, the question is, since 2010, there have been 1,492 new units added to Juneau's housing stock, while our population has remained relatively stable. And we continue to experience a housing crisis. So where have those units gone? And what is the impact, if any, of the short-term rental market in Juneau's housing stock? So that was the question that we put to our research team, and they took after it. And so the data that we have here sort of helps just contextualize the housing situation here in Juneau. This slide here that you can see are the median prices of homes in Juneau. And what you see is that the prices of single homes, townhomes, condominiums, they continue to rise quickly. This chart, the blue is Juneau and the orange is the United States. And these are housing prices in Juneau relative to the US. So this sort of answers the question, wow, it's bad in Juneau. Is it bad everywhere? Yeah, it's generally, it's bad in Juneau. And we're going to see that there are many ways that Juneau has a pretty severe affordability problem. we see the general prices across the US and in Juneau trending in the same general direction. Okay, so we're not alone in this problem. The home sales are the price of a single family attached home. This is just a little more granular detail showing us Juneau, Alaska, and national. So we're seeing, like the last slide said, we're on the same trend. This slide shows us that relative to national prices, when Stevie moves to Juneau, she may find that the prices are higher than where she was in her previous place, though I don't think they were, because she happens to be in an expensive town. But our prices are expensive here in Juneau. We see the similar trend with rental costs. And so we looked at this, and there's a lot you see on that slide. And we looked at just the average rent across Alaska. We picked lots of communities: Fairbanks, Kodiak, Matsu, Wrangell. We just tried to pick lots of different communities, and Juneau is right at the top in terms of our rents are the highest. Okay, it's hard to afford here in Juneau. So be thinking, supply and demand here in our economics, high prices. We have high demand. Sales, days on market. We have data now right through September, and the days on the market for selling a unit is the shortest we've seen in a really long time. It's less than a week. And we thought there'd be a little bit of a slowdown here in the last few months, and we're really not seeing much of a slowdown. It is just really quick, which again shows huge demand for housing in Juneau. Vacancy rates are a way to look at this as well. So this slide here is a bit of data to get your head around here. There's a couple things going on, so we're a little slower on this slide. So the yellow versus blue bars are the rent in Juneau versus rent in Alaska. And so you see that the cost is high, yellow, higher than most places across Alaska. And then the lines that are going up and down, those are the vacancy rates. And you see the vacancy rate for rentals is the red in Juneau, which is very low. And the line across, that straight line across the time, it's 7%. I'll give you two numbers. 7%, that's the national rate. What you want is 5-6%. Approximately. You don't really want too much higher, but you don't want 3%. And what that means is you want a vacancy rate in general so that your renters are, if the vacancy rate is too low, there's really no incentive for the renters to do anything but raise your price or just continue to rent. If there's a little bit of a 5% vacancy rate, then the market effect starts to work in, and people have an incentive to make sure that your rent is a reasonable price for what you're getting, because if it's not, then the renter has an option to go find something else, right? And we're being below 5-6%, which we are, generally means that that it's a sign of too tight of a rental market, not enough facilities. This is the housing permits. The blue across the time, this is over the last decade. We have pretty solid production of single family residents year over year, not enough to meet our needs by any means. And then we have these multifamily units that come on occasion, which help a lot. But this just gives you a sense of the pace of housing and permits and new homes being built, tracked super closely.
Mr. Holst, Mr. Bryson has a question.
Mr. Holst, thank you. This is great stuff. Pertinent to this slide, I understand there's 1,400 housing units came on board. How many housing units came offline, either to fire or condemnation, or I don't know, what are the other reasons why a housing unit can no longer be occupied as a housing unit? Do we have any idea how many housing units we've lost?
We do. And if I will get to that slide. Can I just wait to get there? Yeah, we're headed that direction. And I do want to kind of frame this up. I'm trying to go as quickly as I can, because there's a lot here, but I do think it's important to kind of layer some data in here, and then you'll see the conclusions, Mr. Bryson. So short-term rentals. So we've talked to you about tight labor market and this question, we have this short-term rental phenomena came on board. We understand what a short-term rental is. It's less than anything that's a rental for typically less than 30 days. The number of short-term rentals has tripled in the US in the last 5 years. AirDNA, which is a company that sells data about short-term rentals around the world, they are saying that 1/4 of folks, when they're making plans to travel, now consider a short-term rental instead of a hotel. They don't all go that direction, but the short-term rentals are just becoming a permanent part of the landscape for looking for places to stay. And we have, and we'll explain a little bit how we got there, but we know in Juneau there are at least 300 rentals that have short-term rentals that have taken units out of the market. It's not quite 600, but it's somewhere above 300. So this is now just diving a little bit to your understanding of short-term rentals. Really hard to get data. You've hired one of the firms that we had looked at earlier this summer, Hamari. We got some data from them. We have some data now from AirDNA. Once you guys have your contract in place, you'll have even better data than we've had access to, but it is tricky to get data. So this just simply shows the number of new listings for short-term rentals year over year. The Hamari data that we have is dated for early this summer. But on the next slide, you see some data that we purchased from another source. And I mentioned that there's two different sources because the data, they're close, but they're not identical.
Ms. Gladys.
Just a good question. You say new short-term rentals listed per year. Where's that from? I mean, how do you know that?
So
They're new versus old, or you don't just look on Airbnb and VRBO and count. I mean,
that's exactly what they do. Yeah, the firms that track this data will report back how many additions have been added into your community of short-term rentals that hadn't been listed before. So these are new.
Okay, I didn't see. Sorry, it said Hatari. I thought you did something. Never mind.
Nope.
They did something.
They did something.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
And this is another firm. Oh, could just back 1 second. Yep. So this is, okay, so let's try to look at these numbers here a little bit. The little 45 crosses out the August of 2022, which was, Mr. Rogers, what were you doing in August?
Lifeline here from Eagle that I was doing an Ironman.
Thank you. That was good. That was great. So anyway, clearly a peak, a lot of independent travelers into Juneau. We've seen a little decline. If you look over several years, you see that in the summer times, more people are putting short-term rentals on and then they come back off. Who knows how far down that decline will be, but clearly it seems like a trend of more short-term rentals. Let's keep going. All right. Now, important context here to kind of understand sort of the housing problem and why. Remember, the question we posed was, we built a lot of housing and our population changed not so much. And we have the housing crisis is as bad today or worse than it was 10 years ago. So what's going on? So population is important to understand what's happening with the Juneau's population. So the 1,600 is that bottom line there, that's that dark number. You see that 60 and over population growing over the last decade substantially. And then the only other group that you see making much of a change is there's a slight decline in our 0 to 19, but that's the big change is our senior population. So here's the two things going on here in this graph. So it's hard to see the 2020 and 2010 at the bottom. Blue is 2010 and orange is 2020. Two graphs are, first two bars is the total population. So 10 years apart. Our population in Juneau grew by 980 people in that last decade. The adult population of 20 and older, though, grew by 1,400 people. So, I'm on the school board, we're always rooting for those kids, but the reality is that our youth population is declining and our older population, our adult population is growing. And so what that causes is some interesting characteristics that are really important to understand when we're trying to figure out how much housing does our community need. So here we have a graph showing just the last 5 years of residents in Juneau living alone by age. We see that our 65 years and older doubled from 2015 to 2020, the number of seniors living alone. And so let's keep going. And when we look at it in terms of population, so we see the percentage of aging population. So it turns out that as we have wanted our seniors to stay in Juneau, and they have stayed in Juneau, they also occupy more housing than other folks. And my mom is living in the house that we all grew up in, and it's fewer people that require more housing, right? So let's keep looking at here. So units, and we'll get to Mr. Bryson's question here now. This lot going on here. The top line is, these are the number of units of housing that have been brought into online into Juneau in the last 10 years. The other lines underneath show sort of the breakdown of single family, multifamily, accessory apartments, and mobile homes there at the bottom. But that's the net add. And the next slide is the takeaway, right? Subtract. So this is what we've lost. So when we're looking at the housing supply, we need to understand both. And so the demolished, these are those units that disappeared because, yeah, they're not inhabitable, or they're taken down, or some reason they were just told they're no longer available. And then the short-term rentals. And then again, we have a pretty wide margin here with the data because we just don't have great data. You guys will have better data here pretty soon, but we have a range here of, we know at least this many units went from supporting somebody long-term year-round to just being rented for short-term. And so the net is on this graph, looks a little busy, but with the other two, so the blues are what's being added, taken away. And so the two lines across the top, if you it's somewhere between those two lines, that's the net addition. And so you see, like in 2018, we might have actually lost housing in Juneau because of all the short conversions and demolishing and not enough housing being built. So another way of kind of looking at this is that, yes, ma'am.
Ms. Gladaszewski. Microphone.
The new units versus lost. You say in 2018, so is the number, the two numbers that are printed on the bars are the numbers, so 30 is the number of new units and minus 20 is the number of STRs, blah, blah.
Yeah, that's a great question.
What is those?
It's confusing. Those two numbers represent the range because we're using estimates. So 2018, the most optimistic, we added 30. The most pessimistic and most likely, because is that we lost 20. But somewhere between the two, it's somewhere between the two. Not getting into too many details. The number that we have more confidence in is the lower bar running across.
You said that in 2018 housing, but 30 plus 30 and a minus 20 is 10. So I'm trying to understand.
That is true. You are absolutely correct. If the two numbers, which are just useful to know, because if you're looking at this chart, is we believe that there are at least 300 units taken out, converted for short-term rentals. No more than 600. We're really confident it's not 600. It's probably 350, 375. It's not 450 right in the middle. So if it was 450 and we were pretty confident, we would have put +5 because you did the math, 30 to 20. It's more likely that the short-term rental conversions is closer to the bottom of our range. We can identify 300. The data people say, well, we've seen this listed here. We've seen this listed here. It's hard. People can list something for a week or 2 weeks, and we're not really confident that that represents a loss in conversion. So I guess it's not sufficiently clear here, but it's between those two But I know, and now you do, because I've explained it a little bit more clearly, that it's closer to the bottom of the two numbers. So in any one of those graphs, if you were to pick the lower number, that would be the most, that would be a closer representation as to how much we added to housing that year. Hope that helps you understand.
I'll just say that I'm simply trying to understand the nomenclature on your chart.
Perfect.
And you're talking to me about confidence intervals of your estimates. So I'm just trying to understand what the 2018 bar represents. And if nobody else cares, we could stop and you could tell me later.
It is, if I may, in 2018, what it says is that we believe that the net change in housing in Juneau was -20 to +30.
Was -20. Okay, got it.
+20.
Okay.
Oh, I also, that a long explanation that I gave you, I apologize, Ms. Gladczewski, is that we're more confident that it's closer to -20 than +30.
Got it. I misunderstood your bars. Got it.
Okay, this is try to summarize it simply. We built, this is just 10 years, 1,420 units. We lost short-term rental. We lost demolished units. So the net change is 812, and our population grew by 1,400, our adult population. And we know that our adults, because of the demographics of those adults, want to live in more housing. So what are the conclusions related to the short-term rental and housing specifically? Our adult population has grown a lot faster than the rest of our population. More seniors are staying in Juneau, which is good, but they want to live, or they tend to live by themselves alone. And we are losing some quantity to short-term rentals, demolished, and also acquisition for seasonal workers. And Mr. Bryson, we have tried to get an estimate of how many companies have bought units for their seasonal workers and taken them off market, but we don't have a number that we feel, we have enough ranges, estimates in here that we felt confident in at all. So the impact is that we're 300-ish of our housing market, of our housing units long-term have been converted, we think, permanently to short-term rentals, meaning they're just not available. Even if they're not rented this month, they're not available for a long-term rental. It's higher than 300. We don't know how high. Looking forward to your getting some good data, and you'll know that fairly soon. So our conclusion on this piece is that short-term rental has an impact, but the bigger influence it's just one of many influences. The actual demographic trends in Juneau have a much bigger impact on our lack of housing and our slow pace. So we wanted to add just a couple more thoughts here about the economic impact of the lack of housing. So three quick things. Lack of housing means jobs aren't filled. Lack of housing and expensive housing means there's a cost burden on workers, which dampens your economy. If you're spending more money on your house, you're spending less money on things that you would like to do. And then there's also a problem around, without having good options, we believe it's also a factor for out-migration out of Juneau. People just can't get a starter home and choose to leave. We want to dive in briefly into each one of these quickly. So the lack of housing, we really want to quantify this for you. And it's hard to. So we have some data here to try to measure this out, and we're going to give you some glimpses. So we looked at the 6 of Juneau's largest employers, and we found that there's an average of 20 plus positions open at each of them. And we looked at the state of Alaska. There are over 100 positions open at the state of Alaska, and an administrator at the state of Alaska explained to us that part of the decline in jobs in Juneau isn't because don't attribute it to just that the state doesn't want to have people in Juneau. It's that people are not taking jobs that are available to be taken in Juneau. The school district has 75 vacancies at the moment. Bartlett Hospital has 26 travelers. They indicate to us that there is a role for travelers. They don't need that many. They would rather not have that many. Some of those travelers are taking jobs that in a better scenario, that would be a full-time employee. There's always some role for travelers, but not the account. Coast Guard, as we know, finds it difficult to find housing. And our unemployment rate is incredibly low here in Juneau, meaning if you don't have a job, it's hard to stick around and survive in this community. We have some data. We don't have super recent data, but we did a survey in 2016 of just to give you some anecdotal information, of indicate the degree to which each of the following aspects of Juneau may have influenced your decision to make or continue to keep your permanent residence outside of Juneau. So we surveyed people that have jobs in Juneau, but live outside, right? And these are the answers. The greatly influences this bar. Those people that have a job in Juneau, where somebody in this town is paying their salary, but they live outside, it's housing, you know, whether my wife, spouse or whatever. But it's mostly housing, right? It's just really housing. So the next dimension that we wanted to look at really quickly is the this cost burden. 27% of households in Juneau were cost burdened in 2020. And so there's all sorts of implications of being cost burdens. You spend more on housing and you spend less on other items. We also know that there's a direct, unfortunately, there's a relationship between adverse childhood experiences and families that are cost burdened. And so it's, maybe they can't afford childcare. They don't have a good solution for, anyway, there's a correlation there. And it obviously is housing is a big component of cost of living. And when we look at this graph here has earnings. This is the distribution. This is what your citizens of Juneau look like and how their income is spread across different quintiles, every 20%. And so when we talk about affordability, there's not, as I think you all understand, there's not one number. Affordability is relative to where you are. This 10 years of data shows that in the last 10 years, rent increased by 19.5%. But unless you were in the top quintile, basically your income barely kept up or didn't keep up, right? It's meaning it's tougher for just about everybody in this town, unless you're the wealthiest, to continue to afford housing. Our housing crisis, our housing affordability is getting worse. Okay, and then this is the cost burden. I don't need to go into that, but yeah, 3,457 of our households are cost burdened, right? As the wealthier you get, the less problem you have with cost burden. And then the absence of affordable starter homes affects the mobility. You know, we have a couple things going on. Just a little bit talk about the demographics here. We don't replace our population naturally. Generally, the U.S. is a country that has about a 1.9%, meaning a couple produces 1.9 children, which you need to produce 2, right, to kind of keep things even. And we are below that. We're about 1.4. So, like the nation relies on migration, immigrants coming in for our country. So does Juneau, right? And we haven't seen any in-migration to Juneau since 2013, which is we're seeing that people are leaving faster than they come in. So that's a challenge and we think it's attributed in part, these are all part due to the expense of living here in Juneau. So projecting the needs, I got one more slide for you. This is the grand finale. So we really want to try to be as constructive as possible in coming up with some sort of contribution about how big is our problem. We know we need to build more units. We have a huge deficit. The trends of household sizes and the desires to live alone, there's no indication that that's going to reverse itself. And our demographics about an aging population also tend to have fewer people per household. Those all push the need for housing. The population in Juneau, if we can address our housing crisis, can go up. We produce jobs. When we produce jobs that can afford to live here, but people choose not to live here because, as we saw in that survey, they choose to not spend all that money on housing. We need more supply. And so what is the number? By 2030, we need to find a way to produce about 1,500 new units in Juneau in order for us to keep where we want to go, to meet the needs of Juneau. And there's sort of two numbers here, and 1,500 is a very loose number. There's definitely some thought behind it, but there's a lot of assumptions in there. So I don't want to presume that it's but I wanted to give you magnitude of numbers. And when we look at the projection of the Department of Labor projects that Juneau's population from now till 2030 will decline. And that could very well happen, right? Because they don't, in their projections, they don't include economic factors, right? They don't say, oh yeah, you've got a new project, you can attract people and then you're going to build housing for them and that's going to work. They look at the history of where you are, they look at the age of our population, they look at our trends about, in migration and out migration, and their conclusion is that basically the way we're going is we're going to have about 1,000 fewer people in 2030. So we've given you two numbers. We're, eternally optimistic here at JDC. So we said at least current population. And we're convinced that there is a relationship. If there is housing, people will stay in this community. But if we don't build housing at the rate we need to keep housing, yes, they'll be dying. But even with their projected need, we still need housing, right? We still need more housing for this community to keep it somewhat affordable. That's it.
Thank you, Mr. Holst. Okay, guys, we have 7 years. Let's do it. Ms. Gladaszewski.
Thank you. This is really good stuff. The number, I'm not so focused on the number. It doesn't matter so much because we all know we need housing. But since you gave us one, did you look at what was in the housing action plan? Did you use the same methodology? I don't know what methodology they use there, so I couldn't compare. But is it comparable to what they did then? You didn't say how you came up with 50.
Right. Yep. No, we didn't. I think we learned a little bit from that housing action plan. I think the numbers take into consideration several factors. We think short-term rentals are going to continue to remove housing from the market. We think that people that can be in Juneau will continue to age in Juneau, and we don't see any reason they're going to give up their houses at any faster rate than they are because they have nowhere to go as a senior. We projected in, which we don't think was in the previous plan, we didn't see it, was any decrease, right? Because you need to, and not only do you need to produce housing for what's coming ahead of you, you have to produce housing that replaces housing stock that has been lost. And we also believe the trends about it's also young adults are choosing to not roommate as much as 10 years ago, 20 years ago, less rooming. So more people are looking for single. So all of those, Ms. Gladaszewski, make our projection, our methodology arrive at higher numbers than if we had done it the way it was done 10 years ago.
Ms. Wall.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On this number here, I think I heard the answer, but just to clarify, like you're talking about, you're projecting how much we need to build as opposed to how much we need to gain net. Like you're assuming that short-term rentals, as an example, will continue to go up.
Correct. Yeah.
Thanks.
And we're considering that, you know, we have assumptions in there. We have a lot of assumptions. We have demolished rate. We have a short-term rental rate. We have aging rate in place. All of them lead to this range here. Again, but I would say we're plus or minus several hundred.
Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Holz, for this. So from your report, I see something where you said, well, maybe this is the answer, I guess. Very few non-local individuals and business own more than one unit. I guess from what you've seen, it doesn't appear that there are outside entities buying up a lot of property. It doesn't, from what my sense from the report, that isn't the case. Is there a sense that there are people in town, companies, whatever, however they're organized, buying multiple, maybe less than 10, but more than, anyway, any trends or things you're seeing in that regard?
Yes, there are some owners of multiple units for sure. And it's something we want to continue to look at very, very, very carefully. So what we don't have is good access to historical data, but we do have the snapshot in time. So that's something that we're going to be looking at closely. There is a number in there. I think it's like 14% are owned by people outside of Juneau. And that's a number that we want to watch carefully because it is a very lucrative. It's a very lucrative short-term rental market. The returns are pretty substantial in the summer. Is it enough to really get an outside investor to come or not? We don't know, and we don't see a lot of that. But there are multiple owners, and there are some out-of-town people. But they can be out of town for a lot of reasons. You could be in the Coast Guard, and you move someplace else, and you still own a house, and you rent it. That isn't the person that we're looking for. We're looking for, commercial owners that are buying multiple units.
Thanks. And you mentioned, I think you got off to my second question, and that was seasonality of short-term rentals. I mean, from my personal experience, very high interest in the summer, not implosion, just nearly complete collapse after September 30th. I mean, very, very light interest. Unsure what will happen with the legislative season or session. I mean, I guess even a seasonal short-term rental is still disruptive to long-term housing because, I mean, I'm taking on a roommate for these months until another one will come in the legislative session, and then planning to probably have them and then potentially Airbnb over summer. So that is, I guess, a home that is not available to someone trying to move out. Well, I live there, but anyway.
Yep, that spot on. And our summer's long enough that it just really ruins. I think we all heard those anecdotal stories at the beginning of summer, very heartbreaking, where people that were in a place were asked to leave because the landlord knew that what they could make in the summer was better than they could make an entire year of renting to that. And that's probably gonna continue because we do not recommend, no one's asked me yet, but JDC does not see a reason for us to shut down short-term rentals. That's a reality in our world. It's your judgment as to when it becomes a problem or not. And I think having the data will be super, super helpful. But it is, if we don't build housing, then short-term rentals is a huge threat. But if we can build housing, then I think there's room for short-term rentals as well.
That's a nice segue into a question I had that you kind of touched on maybe in the board meeting today, and that we need a place for visitors to stay. Do you think there's any correlation between our number of hotel rooms and, you know, maybe a few steps later, our housing supply?
Number of hotel rooms and our housing supply, meaning that because we have few hotel rooms, people see the opportunity to use short-term rentals. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, and I think it's great that if anyone owns a hotel in Juneau, we should encourage them to be open all year.
Ms. Gladaszewski, and then Mr. Bryson.
This is some good information about short-term rentals. We also know anecdotal stories about visitor industry purchasing houses for their people because they don't have houses. Same kind of a vicious cycle because we don't have a lot of housing, so then they buy one. Do you know of any way to quantify that? I mean, you know, the house is bought by ABC company, but sometimes you don't know. Anyway, any way to get a handle on data about that, other than the 5 companies I know that did that and the upstairs of the South Franklin ones?
Yeah, thanks, Ms. Gladaszewski. Yes, I think we're going to get there eventually. We have made some. You know, what we can find is, you know, we can look at the assessor database, we can see who the owners are, and we can tie back those owners to businesses. It's tedious, and we've started along that route to kind of see what the magnitude of that issue is, but we don't have a good number for you. I think the solution, you know, I think there are some other solutions we should consider about seasonal housing as an investment that we could make into our community. So that regular housing isn't taken off the market. But but we will have a better number for you, and I think in a few months.
Exactly. I mean, it's a vicious cycle. If there's not a lot of housing, they'll buy housing because they've got the money, and it makes it worse. And then everybody has to buy one because the last guy bought one, and no place for their seasonal people to live. Thanks.
Mr. Bryson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Hulse. So Juneau's had quite a few regular like bed and breakfasts, and even before the Airbnb internet wave, there were handfuls of bed and breakfasts. How do bed and breakfasts tie into this number? Because a bed and breakfast ideally is a short-term rental, or do you classify that as a hotel? But yet we had some bed and breakfasts that were nice homes that were literally in the neighborhoods. How is a bed and breakfast separate or classified in your information? And could that have some impact on the numbers? A bed and breakfast that might have not advertised on Airbnb realized, well, I'm doing the same thing. Why not get more customers for my bed and breakfast? How do those traditional bed and breakfasts fit into this Airbnb scenario? And how much is that impacting the number? Thank you.
You know, I don't know exactly, Mr. Bryce, because you raised a good point. I'm not sure how, because I think there are some Airbnbs that advertise some bed and breakfasts that advertise on VRBO and Airbnb. There could be a little bit of crossover there. You're right. So that's a good question.
Ms. Wall.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You know, the Assembly has passed quite a few kind of large, significant changes in the last year meant to increase units. And, you know, we're going to wait and see if some of those have any impacts. I think my question is, you know, do you have concerns about flooding the market, or are you on team do everything we possibly can think of?
Oh, I know. I think you guys should keep the pedal to the floor. Because I think the good thing about Juneau is that we have a well-diversified economy that that generates jobs. And, you know, if you built too many houses, you know, we might have more people, right? The scenario of building too much housing based on where we are now, just seems really, really remote.
Mr. Rogers.
Chair, if you might indulge me, I'm curious to ask Mr. Holst a question. I feel like the assembly hears a lot from developers that building multifamily housing just doesn't pencil out very well. But the inverse argument seems to be true. If everybody's making zillions of dollars on short-term rentals, why doesn't those zillions of dollars incentivize somebody to build another hotel? And we have not had a new hotel in quite some time. It seems like the economic incentives would point to somebody being able to make money building a hotel.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you, Mr. Rogers. And there are people that poke around. We get inquiries. When somebody's a developer's coming through, that's a common call we will get. Hey, can we stop by and get some data on Juneau's economy? Yeah, I think it would be. I think you could make a good case for hotels. There is some capacity. I think with the Bear not being closed this winter, we saw the incredible prices that resulted. It's really hard to imagine that somebody couldn't make some hotels work capacity, and the remaining hotels were largely at capacity. There's what you hear though is that they're cyclical, right? And like Mr. Smith pointed out, there's a time like tonight, there's probably a lot of vacancy, and that's where folks stumble. Is they see the unevenness of the market in Juneau for hotels. And I think that's what makes people second guess, and they don't make the investment. It makes it go from what seems like a pretty obvious investment to this looks like a high amount of risk. That's my impression, because people have looked and they've not come back.
Mr. Smith.
I actually have one on something that Mr. Holst had in his report, but I think it's more of a question for Mr. Rogers. That's okay. And that's the Airbnb VRBO. I guess I don't need to get into interstate sales tax compact stuff. Can we compel them to collect and remit sales tax for these short-term rentals, or work with that? Or maybe not compel is the right word. Can we do that, or are we doing that? And if not, why not?
Assemblymember Smith, the chair, they're already due. I mean, they're already required. I mean, if you're operating a short-term rental in Juneau, you are required to collect sales tax and hotel bed tax.
Yeah, that fair. Is there a way to cut I'd like to not have to do it. And I think it would lead to higher remittance of the sales tax. If I'm not saying that people aren't doing it, but I would imagine that some are not, yet they're using the app. I mean, like if I didn't, I don't know how maybe you would catch me, but anyway, I'm sure there's people out there maybe taking that risk. Is there a way we can essentially get the me's out of there, and it's collected by the companies, remitted to the city? Anyway, for higher.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Smith. We have touched on the subject before and not made progress. It is our understanding that at least Airbnb, which is now the dominant player in the space, but it's certainly not the only one, does allow communities like Juneau to enter into an agreement with Airbnb to collect and remit the tax. This is that model would be akin to what we do, for example, with Uber or Lyft. So the way that the sales tax code works for Uber and Lyft is that individual drivers are not collecting and remitting sales tax to us. Uber and Lyft, as the third party facilitator, that's marketplace facilitator, they collect and remit that sales tax on behalf of their drivers, who are independent contractors using Uber to connect them with people who need rides. We could do that with Airbnb. There has been a criticism from the sales tax office, which is really on the front, two fronts. One is conceptual. So really, if you own a home and you rent it out, the responsible party for collecting or remitting sales tax is the owner. That's just been kind of a conceptual thing, but you could make the same argument about an Uber driver. I think the more practical concern is that if we only do it with Airbnb, for everybody who lists on Airbnb and VRBO and Craigslist and other platforms, they would still have to file those sales manually. So I think the challenge we've had is that we understand that Airbnb will strike that deal to collect and remit sales tax, hotel bed tax, which probably makes sense for all those rentals, but it doesn't necessarily save owners from having to do that similarly on other platforms, because our understanding is that they do not. So sort of a mixed answer, a little uncomfortable. I think if the assembly was to clearly indicate to us that they want us to move forward with Airbnb in that direction, we would.
Ms. Hale and then Ms. Glaszewski.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Along the lines of this questioning, does the sales tax office have a number, you know, like Mr. Holz was estimating between 300 and 600 short-term rentals? Does the sales tax office actually have a number of short-term rentals paying sales tax? Do you have that number?
Yeah, thank you. That's a totally good question that we get asked a lot. There's a couple of challenges for the sales tax office. One is that there's a difference between a sales tax filer and a unit, right? So we have lots of sales tax filers with multiple short-term rental units. We do not always know when we have a sales tax filer how many units they have. So even if I was to say, here's all of everybody who's filed who we know is a short-term rental operator, we may not know how many units that correlates to. That's going to get fixed. As Mr. Holz noted, we eve of or have just signed a contract with Harmari, which is one of the companies that does this kind of research. We will completely solve that problem and that question once we have Harmari services. So at some point in the next 3 to 4 months, I will bring back a full report from Harmari on what the landscape really looks like, which they do by having very sophisticated crawling scripts that just survey the internet and see what's going on. And then they match that up with property ownership from our databases. It's quite sophisticated what they're doing. And so I'll be able to answer that question with some precision, but I can't today. Well, I'm sorry, just one last thing. We have thought, we have been using in the range of 300 for some time. And I'm glad that Mr. Holz's research got us into that ballpark. That number appears to have grown from something in the range of 200, maybe 5-6 years ago, cresting over 400 around Ironman. And in the last year, when I've been asked that question, I would say something in the range of 300. So we've been in the ballpark, but we don't know with precision how many there are, but we will.
Ms. Glaszewski and then Mr. Smith.
Just to follow up on what you have a number of filers, you just don't have a number of units.
We do have the number of filers.
Yeah. So, but what I was going to talk about was the auto remittance of sales tax to Airbnb from Airbnb to the city. I thought we already had said go forth and do, because we certainly said that about Uber. Maybe I smooshed them all together, but I thought we were pursuing that. And I don't recall knowing that VRBO wouldn't do that. So Airbnb would, but VRBO won't. Is that what I understand? The answer to that part?
Something I'm glad, that's my understanding, but these things evolve all the time. I think that if the Assembly's direction is for staff to pursue direct remittance of hotel bed tax and sales tax with these operators, we would proceed to do that. And we wouldn't stop with Airbnb. We would make overtures to other companies.
I would move if that.
Ms. Hale.
I just know, I just have this memory that when we talked about this before, we had concerns and you expressed concerns, and one of those is the loss of data, loss of individual information that we would get. And so before we jumped on board, I wonder if we could wait until we get this Harmari research, and then maybe that is the direction that we move forward in.
I don't recall any staff reluctance for data. I just don't recall that if there's some objection.
Yeah, I think Assemblymember Hale is correct.
Two people, one's up and down, two people no.
We have represented that as a concern. You would, had we signed a deal with Airbnb, you would have lost a lot of visibility. Even knowing the number of registrants, even being able to kind of for us to say about 300, we would have lost a lot of that visibility had we gotten one check every filing period from Airbnb. but Assemblymember Hale gets exactly to the right answer. We're gonna get that information a totally different way. So on a staff, as it relates to staff, that is no longer a concern. You're gonna be getting information about short-term rentals from another way. The fact that we would get a consolidated payment from Airbnb is no longer a concern.
Okay, we do have, do you?
No,
your motion?
it just depends on if you want the tax revenue or you want some information that is inadequate about number of units, which we don't get anyway, but anyway.
Mr. Smith.
With it, will the Hamari data tell you it on which will it give you platform information? Will it say X% just does Airbnb, X% does more than one? Will we get
My understanding, the answer to that question is yes. Mr. Schomburg, yes. Yes, I think we're going to get very robust data back from Harmari about platforming, about number of rentals, about how they're registered, about how they're used, about structure type. I mean, I think we're going to get a lot of reconnaissance information.
With that, I mean, I'm still working through my mind. Does it make sense to grab the biggest, apple off the, anyway, does it make sense to get that, to get Airbnb, but should we wait to get that data before deciding? I don't know.
We could also have a discussion about this topic in particular at another meeting and work through all of the what ifs and maybe
Not hijack.
No, it's just, I know that we've been concerned also about bringing the public along with us. And so that would give us a chance to do that as well. Ms. Wall.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A quick question to follow up on that. Where are we on timeline for getting this data at a level that we can discuss it?
Assemblymember Wall, my understanding is that contract is being signed now. I mean, I don't know if it was signed yesterday or today or tomorrow, but it's being signed actively now. My understanding is that as soon as Harmari flips the switch, we'll have a portal where we're going to be able to see certain information automatically that its web crawler has already deciphered. The process that takes Harmari time is that it will go into each one of our listings that its web crawler finds, and it will attempt to link those records back to our property database. That takes Harmari time. So I think that we'll have some information, I think, immediately. And if I actually got super interesting information tomorrow, I would probably just send it out to you. I think it'll be 3 to 4 months before we get a full report back from Harmari that does the work of trying to connect each one of those property listing. And that'll just be additional information, but we'll know a lot more then about what that stock of short-term rentals looks like.
We had discussed the idea of requiring registration ordinance that we looked at, but maybe that's where I'm dreaming. What happened?
Chair Dream, the Assembly has talked a lot about requiring registration of short-term rentals, but we have not reviewed an ordinance that would do that. An ordinance does exist to do that, but I'm not sure it's ever come to a committee.
Okay, well, it's good to know I'm not entirely making that up.
We've never seen it. It exists.
Okay.
We did thought we did have a motion.
Chair Team, we do have a lifeline. Mr. Palmer is on the phone, and he is aware of an ordinance that is somewhere in its drafting process to require registration of short-term rentals. I'm just not sure that I'm not sure staff have felt like there was clear direction from the Assembly on that particular concept.
Okay. We'll bring that back at a different meeting then. I'm glad to know I didn't imagine the entire thing. Any more questions for Mr. Holst or on this topic? Oh, okay.
Taking it away. I just say, if it's about data, we're going to get it from Hamari. I mean, do we want the revenue for sure or not? And I think the answer is yes, we should. And especially if we're not getting the information we thought we were getting by not. Anyway, I just think we should do it. And I don't know that we need to wait until we get any more data. So I'd like to
Could you clarify again what your motion is?
To ask staff to globally to go to approach the companies, Airbnb, VRBO, whatever are the big players, and see if they will collect sales tax for their, whatever you call their users, their owners, just like we do for Uber and Lyft.
Mr. Bryson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think my question would be, do we think that people are not submitting, but they're advertising on Airbnb and VRBO, but they're not submitting the appropriate taxes to Juneau? Do we suspect a lot of that is going on?
Assemblymember Bryson, I can only imagine that compliance is not 100%.
Okay.
Somebody out there has had a short-term rental and not collected or remitted hotel bed tax and sales taxes. I think sometimes there is a claim that that rate of non-compliance is really high. I don't really have evidence that it's really high, but certainly, as Mr. Holst pointed out, there's a lot of short-term rentals where somebody takes a 2 or 3 week vacation and they see an opportunity and they rent out their place for 2 or 3 weeks. We just don't have, I mean, there's not an army of staff looking for those. There's just not. So we do hope and expect that the public will do the right thing under the law. Certainly during Ironman, I give Ms. Perry at Travel Juneau a lot of credit. She was really direct with people and saying, yes, we want you to open your homes, but here's a little form of the process you need to follow with the city to collect and remit sales tax and hotel bed tax. So I think that there has been, you know, worthwhile efforts to help people understand that even when they were going to rent out for short and incidental times. But I don't think it's a huge problem, but compliance is certainly not 100%.
Ms. Hale.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just clarifying question for Ms. Gladaszewski, because I got lost there, all my fault. Is your request that staff look into, you know, like contact VRBO, contact all these different agencies that do this, and then come back to us and say, here's what we found out. And then at that point, we could say, well, then we want you to start having them collect. Is that what you're saying? Or are you saying just start having them collect?
I was saying, go forth to all of the companies who do this and see if they would, and if they would, then do. I didn't think we needed to hear about it again. And yeah.
I mean, I don't want to make a big stink, but you know, maybe you know me or maybe you don't, but you know, this is just a presentation on Juneau housing stock and short-term rentals. And all of a sudden we're taking a fairly dramatic action on short-term rentals, and I don't feel comfortable with that.
Mr. Bryson.
Thank you, Ms. Hale, for saying that, because that's what I was trying to dig at. I'm concerned about blowback or consequences that we took an immediate action as we're trying to gather information. And while I don't necessarily think that that should be a concern of ours all the time, if we're trying to do this right, we're trying to get the short-term rental solved. To profit generators, tax generator, it's people's personal property.
Sure.
I'm concerned if we do something too quickly that
I can take it back and say, come back and tell us what you find then. And actually, I think it's easier for people who it's better if you're going to do it. It just does it automatically. You don't have to file. You don't have to take a form. You don't have to, it just does it. So anyway, I think it'd be easier for everybody, but if the group wants to hear more information, then it's okay with me.
Well, good luck.
Yeah, thanks. I know I've been quiet through this because it feels like deja vu. I know that we've had these conversations before. I know that we approved the funding for the Hamari study, and I thought the whole intent was that we were moving towards taxation. Like, I thought we had this conversation already. So I'm in support of this motion, and thankful you put it forward.
Mr. Smith.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I should have done this probably previously as we started to do this. As a disclosure, I have rented my home as an Airbnb. I have been advised by the attorney that because the scope of these actions are broad and that they're not just personally affecting me or my finances, that I don't need to recuse myself, but it's the attorney's online, and I would imagine he'd speak up if that were untrue. And then I'm supportive of the motion too. I still am trying to figure out where's the right way to bring up something that's not on the agenda. But I mean, anyway, I think owners need to collect and remit sales tax, and if they aren't, anyway, I'd be open to, you know, staff can do a little digging and let us know what they hear. But I mean, from a general premise, people should be collecting and remitting sales tax, and if the company's doing it on their behalf, we know the compliance, at least for these larger companies, is going to be 100 versus not 100 if people are doing it on their own. Thanks.
Okay, what is the status of the motion? The motion now is to bring it back or to move forward?
I'm sensitive that I don't know when you make a motion about this kind of thing. If not, it is a presentation. So do we have to, at the some meeting, write down, we're thinking about doing this? I mean, obviously, I don't know. I didn't mean to hijack the thing, but he just said he wasn't sure. And I thought, I felt like you did that. I thought we did that. So, do you have an opinion about that, Madam Chair?
Well, it depends on what the motion is. I am hesitant to move forward right now and say, go do it, for two reasons. One is I think that we have learned recently that we need to bring the public along with us on changes that affect them, or we get a lot of blowback. And the other reason is the one that Mr. Rogers mentioned about if a person has a unit listed on multiple platforms, they may still end up having to do the manual process of remitting sales tax, and that doesn't actually make things easier for them. I'm not as concerned about the compliance rate because I assume that our compliance rate is similar to any other thing like sales tax. I'm sure we don't get 100% compliance on sales tax either. So I'm going to assume good faith and good operations of our short-term rental owners. Yeah, I'm just hesitant to do it without giving the public a little more notice that that's what we're talking about doing. And I don't know if we have any media listening tonight who might publish this in a story tomorrow, but I'd like, none. Okay. So I don't feel good about doing it that way.
Okay, then the motion is to have staff approach all the relevant companies and find out if they'll do it. And we can talk about it yet again, I would say.
Any objection to that? Seeing none, that motion passes. We'll talk about that again. Any final questions for Mr. Holst, who has been sitting here patiently?
Sorry, didn't.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Mr. Holst. It clearly spurred a great conversation and gave us a lot to think about.
Thank you, Ms. Dream. And if I may, I failed to thank the data that we get. We need to thank the Finance Office, Mr. Chambor. We need to thank the Department of Labor. And then we have a great team at JDC that puts together this work, James, Anton, Sam, and Robin, who leads the group. So I just felt, while you were talking, I remembered I did not thank the great people that work so hard to make this possible. So thanks for the time tonight.
Yeah, thanks. And we'll take a 5-minute break. Our next agenda topic, we're on numbers now with the new agendas, not letters. Adjustment to purchasing threshold. Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Chair Treem. So this is on page 30 of the printed packet that was distributed to you, not the red folder items. So the very last page, page 30 of the regular packet, is a memo from me proposing to add a new purchasing level. So this is, CBJ has not tinkered with its purchasing code in quite some time. And I, in the more than 3 years that I've been here now, have also not tried to tinker with it, but it has frequently been an area of concern for client departments. I get a lot of, sort of low-level complaining from directors and program staff who need to buy stuff. And really the challenge is that Juneau's procurement code as it exists today kind of goes from 0 to 60. So under $5,000, we ask people to apply reasonable and adequate procedures, which basically means don't do something stupid. Over $5,000, we immediately go to a public solicitation, meaning that we put out to the public via a formal or informal way the ability for anybody in the world to bid on our needs for goods and services. That structure is unique. We couldn't find another municipality in the state that does it that way. Certainly, it's very disconnected from the state of Alaska. And what it really means on a working basis is if one of our programs needs to buy $5,000 worth of dirt, we're going to put it out to a public solicitation that's going to be on the street for a number of days, and people are going to have to submit proposals to us. And it's just probably not commensurate with the savings that we obtain by that level of public competition, right? Obviously, that takes a lot of staff time, both in purchasing and more so in the client department. What we see when we look across the spectrum of our peers is that all of our peers use verbal and written quotes at some level, meaning that they don't have public solicitations. They simply call a number of vendors and say, what's your best price on this item? What we are proposing in this memo, and there's no action for the assembly other than to say, yes, we think this is a good idea or a bad idea, or we have questions, we will bring back an ordinance. But what we're proposing is to add a level of purchasing between $5,000 and $25,000, where rather than a public solicitation, we simply get 3 written quotes from 3 known vendors. I think that a couple of things are true. As we work on both the code and our internal policy for doing that, certainly if there are 4 competent qualified vendors in Juneau, we're going to require that people get 4 written quotes. 3 will be a minimum number. There's a little, the code's got to care for many circumstances. So if there are only 2 vendors, we'll need to have something to do. If there's only 1 vendor, we wind up using the code's sole source provisions. But if there's 2 vendors instead of 3, we'll have to nuance some of that stuff, both in the code and the process. But what we're proposing to do is to add a purchasing level that reduces the administrative burden for purchases underneath $25,000. And then we would retain the same thing we do today for purchases between $25,000 and $50,000, which is an informal public solicitation process where we publicly notice that we're soliciting goods. And then over $50,000 is a formal sealed bid process like most people are familiar with. So I think that's all I have to say on this. Happy to take questions or just go back and work on it and bring an ordinance.
Ms. Hale.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm curious that we say 5,000 to 25,000 when I'm looking at all these other communities that have 40,000, 100,000, that's a state. 25,000 Fairbanks, 50,000 City of Ketchikan. And I'm curious why we would lowball it when we're trying to actually make this work more efficiently, and why we wouldn't just go with 5,000 to 50,000 rather than 5,000 to 25,000. If we have it as an ordinance, we'll put it out there for public notice, and we'll make sure that the people who bid on these things have an opportunity to look at it and comment on it in case they think that they would be injured by it. But I would think if we're trying to be more efficient, let's just take out that middle step and just make the written quotes be 5,000 to 50,000 and then get rid of that informal public solicitation. And between the 5,000 and 50,000, we'd pop up the formal sealed bid. That's the question I have. If we're going to make it easy, let's make it easy.
Assembly Member Hale, I think I take your point. I'm not sure there's necessarily a question there. I think that this proposal, I think, probably represents the least that we could or should do. I think that's fair.
Mr. Watt.
Thank you, Chair. I think it's a good question. I think within CBJ's kind of budget and purchasing culture, incremental change is probably the best. So we have employees who probably fall both sides of this issue. We have employees that would like greater purchasing limits. We have traditionalists that think that we should really clamp down. I don't think it's analogous to us, but you do see other communities in the news who make some major purchasing errors in their process. I think this step would be a good improvement and a good incremental change for the city. Doesn't go too far. I think we just want to be careful when we give more latitude to public employees spending public money.
Well, Kadak.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the limits and kind of slow rolling this. And I'm grateful for the chart that you gave us here. What is it called? The graph that you gave us so that we could see the differences between communities and understand where everybody else is at. I'm more comfortable with kind of like slow roll into 5 to 25, see how that goes, and then maybe think about increasing. And for the simple fact that 3 written quotes, I have my 3 favorite vendors, and these are the ones I'm going to ask for quotes from without, diversifying all of our business through businesses throughout Juneau or further to ensure that we're getting a good swath of business in. And I guess to that, my question would be, kind of purchases do we do for $25,000?
Good question.
Yeah, Assemblymember Walal Gadak. I mean, we do all kind. I mean, we literally purchase everything that you can imagine in that category, both goods and services. And I think that's maybe the thing that helps to remember. So, in that amount, we purchase all kinds of commodities, dirt, steel, materials of all kinds. When we have construction projects internally that we're managing, we hire a lot of service providers at that level. So anytime we talk about doing a survey, for example, that is often in that category. Anytime we hire a professional economist, something like that to write a report, it's often in that category. I mean, we hire a lot of services and service providers in that range, as well as commodities. So there's a lot of purchasing in that category between 5 and 25. I will note this, and it's something that the manager's office and I do wrestle with. There are a lot of ways to not competitively solicit through CBJ's purchasing code, the greatest of which is to ride other contracts. So our purchasing code allows us to ride any state contract or any other municipality in the state's contracts. So we very frequently have client departments riding a state contract, which includes what the NASPO contracts, which are big group purchasing contracts. So there's a lot of ways around using competitive solicitations generally. I would hope that with 3 written quotes in this category, we would actually see more client departments choose instead to just get 3 written quotes rather than ride a state contract. Because one of the things that we know is that it is occasionally efficient to ride a state contract, but it may not actually be the best price for something. And that's just, it's a challenge of efficiency in government and purchasing. Riding state contracts, riding other people's contracts is efficient, but we don't always really know that it's going to be the best price for something.
While we have this topic in front of us, and since we talk about inflation a lot, do any of these other levels need to be adjusted looking at this, or are the rest of them good?
Yeah, thank you, Chair Treem. I think it's totally a policy decision. Obviously, the state of Alaska is twice what we are to trigger a formal sealed bid. It's also twice what we are for the lowest level of purchasing, which mostly happens on credit cards. I think there are many opinions. I think that the manager's comment that a lot of our purchasing code is designed to build trust between the city as a buyer and between a community of vendors that sell us things. I think these limits are okay. They haven't changed in a while, but relative to where we are with our peers, given the sort of the fabric of Juneau's just vendor community, I think that these thresholds are okay.
Ms. Glaszewski.
I would just move to, the Finance Committee support this proposal. It's very interesting, the difference here. I mean, in the culture, Fairbanks, North Star Borough, you have 40,000, and then city of Fairbanks, 25,000. Like, what's that about? It's the same place, so it's like, That's interesting. I mean, anyway, it's just interesting. So this seems like a reasonable, I personally, as some people have mentioned, would even consider being more like the state of Alaska. I mean, have they had huge problems with their purchasing? I don't know. I haven't seen any in the paper, but anyway, I just support your concept.
Mr. Smith.
Thanks just for a question. And Mr. Rogers, you hit on it, but I didn't necessarily hear what the or how you write it into the ordinance when there are 4 or more people who offer a service, and how are we going to prevent someone who's like, hey, they'd never call. I mean, when you have an informal public solicitation, it's on them to respond. And this other way, what if poor 4th dude never gets called and was like, and you said we do a lot of business. I mean, how do you protect against that?
Yeah, Senator Smith, I think there's no easy answer to that. I mean, I certainly think that we will engineer a process on the purchasing team that reviews those quotes. And certainly if we understand that there are 4 vendors and people have not reached out to that 4th vendor, I think we will compel that to happen. It's interesting. We don't think about this issue at all when we buy $4,000 worth of stuff, right? I mean, you went to wherever you went, you swiped your credit card, you just didn't think about. And maybe, I mean, hopefully, I think that we consistently talk about this. I do think CBJ employees are good stewards of money, right? I don't think people would knowingly pay more than they have to for something because they want their budgets to go as far as possible. At the same time, it's probably not efficient to drive from the big box tool store to the hometown tool store to AIH to whatever to buy a hammer, right? So these are just pure policy decisions. At some point, you have to say enough price seeking is enough. And I think in this category of buying 3 quotes is reasonable. And certainly as purchasing staff conduct the process, if we know that there's a 4th vendor, I think we'll look for quotes from that 4th vendor.
Mr. Watt.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, we're actually very responsive to our vendors. So whenever we put out solicitations, we often get, hey, you shouldn't write it this way, or you should expand it, or you should give us more time, or you're not allowing enough vendors. And that's the role of the purchasing officer. So we respond to that kind of thing all the time.
Ms. Hale.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think that, and I think this is a really good conversation, and I'm totally fine with where we're going with it. I just want to emphasize that between making sure that you're touching everybody and being somewhat efficient, because it's an enormous drain on staff to do formal solicitations. I just recall an episode when I was at DEC, when I was doing a purchase and I wasn't required to go out and get 3 bids because it was under a certain dollar amount, but the purchasing officer told me, well, it's good practice, so go do it anyway. So I just think we really have a responsibility to our responsible staff to not make it harder than it needs to be. And every time a vendor has to write a bid, that takes them time. So it's not, it's an efficiency matter.
Thank you, Ms. Hale. We have a motion from Ms. Gladczewski. Any objection to that motion? The motion that was in the packet.
To support and draft an ordinance to support this concept. And
okay, that motion passes. Next agenda topic is dock electrification update. Mr. Watt.
Thank you, Chair. This really, I think it's super quick. So we talked about dock electrification and the transformer that we needed to buy for the Franklin dock, and we're working through that. And our financial and legal people, essentially said, "Oh, the right vehicle for this is a grant." And normally the assembly approves grants. So we're just kind of letting you know that we're doing a grant unless you object to it. The project costs, normally we expend project costs out of capital projects all the time. Don't tell you once you appropriate it. but a grant to an entity is a little bit different. So it's, I think in our view, a little bit housekeeping. Just wanted to make sure you understood that and didn't find problem with that distinction.
Thank you. Any questions on this one?
Just one brief question. How much is in the CIP? Roughly, or I don't remember anything. Oh, that's good. It's not just me. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. More of a statement, I guess, and it's something I'll bring up at the retreat too. And that's, I guess, having, I don't know if plan or suite of options is a way to say it. It's like, dock electrification, great, $40 million. Is that the right use of funds? And also, what are our plans for using head tax funds into the future? Anyway, this ship may be sailing or might be getting plugged in or whatever you want to call it. But for me, that would be useful just because it's like, or else I feel like we will grab the thing that people are, it might be shiny, it might not be, but people are shaking in front of us and we will go and chase it. Whereas I'm kind of like, is $40 million to save, 1 million gallons of fuel or whatever the number is that really the most effective bang for the buck? Again, maybe I should have brought this up a while ago, but having that information would be helpful for me as well as head tax. Anyway, thanks.
We will definitely have those discussions in the retreat and during the budget process. Okay, moving on. Last agenda item, filing period for very small businesses. Mr. Rogers.
Yep, thank you, Chair Treem. So this idea has percolated a little bit. The Assembly occasionally gets emails to this effect, just from very small business owners, really talking about people who run side businesses, saying that filing sales tax is just difficult. Sometimes that concern manifests as people saying, do we really have to charge sales tax on all these minor things? Staff have consistently maintained that our sales tax code requires us to. But I've long wanted to make it easier somehow for those very small businesses. And the most direct way, I think, to reduce the burden on very small businesses is to eliminate quarterly filing, or allow them the option to opt into annual filing. Under our code, anybody in the borough who makes taxable sales must file quarterly. If you sell $1 of stuff every year, in theory, our code directs you immediately to quarterly filing. There is no provision that allows us for anybody to file annually if they have taxable sales. What I've finally put on paper is the idea of allowing very small businesses, and everybody might define those terms differently, but what I've proposed here is less than $1,000 of tax per year, which is $20,000 in taxable sales. $20,000 in taxable sales and $1,000 of tax is not significantly impactful on CBJ's overall revenue picture. So even in the event that there are delinquencies, it doesn't really change our revenue. Obviously, somebody who sells $20,000 worth of goods or services in every year, that is not their primary livelihood. We are not talking about somebody's mainline business here. We're talking about somebody who has a side gig, making art or jewelry or baked goods or jams or bath salts or whatever they're making, right? So it's a proposal to allow those very small businesses to file annually. I've listed some of the pros and cons. Several sales tax administrators in a row have been skeptical or critical of this idea for all of the reasons that are listed here in the cons. Namely that businesses won't necessarily know what those sales are going to be. Obviously, what happens with small businesses especially is that they collect sales tax. We would tell them it's a best practice to put it in a separate account or whatever, but they're probably not going to do that. They're probably going to cash flow their business with it. And at some point when it's time to remit those taxes, which they've held in trust, they feel like they've got to do that out of their own pocket. It feels like a burden that will probably induce some amount of delinquency. Annual filing will lead to people filing less, which will lead them to be less familiar with the process. So there's any number of these things that will probably lead to a slightly higher level of delinquency with this category of filers. I think that on the net is probably okay for the diminished burden on very small businesses, and frankly, the diminished burden on sales tax office staff. I think it's a trade-off that's worth it. And hopefully very small businesses. I mean, the truth is, because we're only talking about $1,000 taxes a year, the very most that somebody could ever be delinquent is $1,000, right? We're not talking about somebody who's going to accrue a very large balance of unremitted tax. I think given all the pros and cons, I fall on the side of thinking that allowing very small businesses to file annually is both in the city's and the community's best interest. I think if there's any remaining residual question for the assembly at all, is $1,000 the right number? You could make it 500, you could make it 1,500, you could make it 2,000. I have some math about what those look like. Having looked at that math, I think $1,000 is a pretty convenient sweet spot. It's 40% of filers. That number's in this memo, but it's actually kind of staggering to think 40% of the filers in the borough collect less than $1,000 of tax per year. And again, those are people providing personal services, making earrings and jewelry, selling a little bit of jam at the holiday market, whatever. And yet those 40% of filers represent less than 0.5% of the total tax we collect. So I think it's a trade-off working. And I think myself, having looked at the numbers, $1,000 is in the ballpark of something that seems reasonable.
No. Just a motion to direct staff to draft an ordinance to allow sales of less than 20,000 filers who make less than sell less than 20,000 to file annually. And you answered the question I had about why 20,000 if it's 40. I mean, you've satisfied me that it seems reasonable enough.
Ms. Hale.
I don't have an objection to it, but because I would benefit from this, I just want to put that out there. I don't think that I have to speak with the attorney, but I have 2 businesses and one of them is a very small business. So it would be nice to do it once a year.
Mr. Smith.
I'll make the same disclosure. And I was wondering if you're also calculating the loss of late fees, because I know from my small business, I was late. I think 1 year, 4 quarters, which is it's $25 fine. It's a $25 penalty each time. And sometimes I had 0 sales. So I just paid $25 because I didn't buy time and I had no tax due. So anyway, a slight probably additional loss from people like me.
There's one ironic piece of this, which is that the $30 filing discount that people get quarterly is $120 a year. $120 a year is more than 10% of the tax they collect. And for many of these businesses who don't collect 1,000, they collect $500 or $100 in tax. They actually never pay the city any tax at all because the filing discount is larger than the tax that they would have to remit. So
thank you, Mr. Smith, for your contribution. Ms. Wallen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I also have the same disclosure.
Ms. Hale.
I should have read this more closely, but is the quarterly filing or would the annual filing be an opt-in? Like, could people continue to quarterly file if they wanted to? Super. So they could get that $30 discount if they wanted to. Okay, thanks.
Okay. Any more discussion on this topic? Ms. Glashevsky made a motion. Any objection? I see none. That motion passes. Anything else that the Finance Committee needs to discuss tonight? I see nothing. We are adjourned.